Imagine this. It's 2010. You just bought your first brand new Mustang, fitted with the 4.6 liter 3-valve, only to find out that 1 year later, the Coyote engine would appear. That would change everything forever. Let's find out a little bit about why the Coyote engine is so good and some of the history behind it, shall we?
5.0, the return of a legend.
So why is it that Ford's Coyote engine is so good? These are the questions we want to know, right? Well, back in 2010, they were actually working on the first production model of the engine. Hence, why all the 3-valve owners were very mad that they bought a 2010 Mustang, when the next year it was being fitted with a 5.0. First off, the name Coyote. Let's figure out where that came from. The name Coyote itself came from Ford's heritage of racing drivers, such as A.J. Foyt, who actually drove Ford's first ever 4-valve V8 and won an Indianapolis 500 in 1967 and 1977. This was very important because in case there was ever a leak, they could say, oh, what the heck is a Coyote, right? No one knew. So this was extremely confidential, and that's what ultimately happened. Now, the 4.6 and the 5.4 that came out previously were actually very good. However, the tech was outdated. They were using a single camshaft design. Everything was just not where it needed to be. So here's the part about Ford that I think is awesome. So Ford, in order to stay relevant with the times and to increase horsepower as well as increase fuel efficiency, they ultimately stuck with the small block design and decided to engineer the hell out of this. So in order to stay relevant and compete with guys like Chevy's LS3 at the time and Mopar's 6.4 liter Hemi, they needed to do something drastic. And so in 2011, Ford's Coyote engine officially entered production. And right out of the gate, it had an all-aluminum block with a more open deck design. So now came standard with 412 horsepower and 390 foot-pounds of torque before a revision in 2013 and 14 where it got an upgrade in power. It had a cross-bolted main bearing caps. They had piston cooling jets. And they also had a forged steel crankshaft and pretty much shared some of the similarities to the 4.6. So your bore increased and your stroke increased. Your bore went from 3.54 to 3.63, and your stroke went from 3.54 to 3.65. So that's ultimately where the 302 cubic inches came from. But as everybody knows, it's actually like 4.95 liters. So it wasn't official until 2018 when they decided to bore it out a little bit more. They also changed the firing order. They basically swapped around the last initial order. They still start on 1, so it goes 154, 86372. They also have all new aluminum cylinder heads, which actually was one of the strongest moves they could have done because the amount of flow of air is now incredible. The Gen 1 Coyote engine also came out with 11:1 compression ratio. So basically, the cylinder heads were one of the biggest improvements since now you actually had 4 valves per cylinder and you had 2 camshafts that were independently controlled. So ultimately, they came out with the TI-VCT, which is a twin independent variable cam timing. And basically, what it means is that you now have an intake and an exhaust camshaft that were basically working independently of each other. Another interesting part was that the throttle body was also moved. So the throttle body is now sitting right near where the plenum is, where on top of the valley of the V. And then another thing that they did was they relocated the alternator down low, and they also added power steering. So A, let's get rid of the parasitic effects of power steering, and B, we're going to put things where they actually should be because it's easier to service, easier to improve, flow is better, it's more direct, less turns. Everything was just great. Now, the Gen 1 Coyote actually did have many flaws as well. They were only good for about 650 horsepower before you started chucking rods and having all sorts of problems, right? So down the line, in 2011 and 2012, Ford actually released a Boss 302. And the Boss 302 actually had the Roadrunner engine. So you may think, oh wow, Coyote and Roadrunner. Yeah, that's basically the point, right? Roadrunner always caught the Coyote, but the Coyote is an awesome name, and they like the concept, right? So, and it has to do with homage, right? And heritage. Roadrunner engine itself is phenomenal. So it had forged rods, had stiffer springs, had CNC ported heads, had a Boss intake manifold that was the first of its kind to be released, had larger cams, had a 7,500 RPM redline, and it all hit that 444 horsepower mark all the way up in the rev range. So basically what you were ultimately getting was now pretty much a road course ready, out of the box, suspension enhanced vehicle. Where I'm going with this is that the trickle down approach basically happened in Ford as well. So over time, the Gen 2 Coyote came out in the 2015 to 2017 Mustangs. They were now the S550 chassis, and basically what that meant was that you had the same engine as Gen 1, but all the things improved. So each time a moderation and engine comes out, it's going to be improved. So you had increased valve size on the exhaust and the intake. You had oil that was dedicated to go to the phasers. You also had stiffer valve springs. You had upgraded head gasket to basically accommodate the direct feed to the TIVCT now. You had Boss rods, and you had a bump in power. So what that meant is that you basically had a Roadrunner engine, right? So it's great for boost. So 2015 to 2017 engines that were made in all the Mustangs, people were flocking on them like hotcakes, right? Like everybody was going crazy, like wow, like Gen 2 heads were a little bit different. Everything was a little bit different, just for the better. So when you shoved boost down its throat, it responded amazingly. So that's ultimately where that came from. So aside from the changes in Gen 2, we also have Gen 3 that came out in 2018. Now, in my opinion, the 2018 had the most improvements. Obviously, every time you have technology and you're constantly improving, you are going to get those benefits. So Gen 3, right out of the gate, 460 horsepower at 6,500 RPM, 420 foot-pounds of torque at 4,250 RPM. So what's different about it, right? Well, a lot of things actually. First off, same engine block, but it has a different deck design now. So it's no longer more of an open deck, and now it can actually respond more to power without having to worry about sleeving it as early or doing anything. One of the biggest things of the Gen 3 Coyote engine are the fact that it now has direct injection and port injection. So what that meant is that now you can utilize both direct injection into the cylinder to increase power while also using port to fuel the excess needs and everything, or vice versa, whatever you want it to. So you had new phasers and camshafts, obviously due to the direct injection and port injection, and you had an increased oil capacity. They're up to like 10 quarts now. My Coyote had roughly 8 quarts, I believe. So significant improvement. In addition to that, you had a higher cam lift and you had taller valves. Now, and you also now, standard in 2018, you had plasma coated cylinder walls. So it's a pro and a con there, because if they do flake off or anything, you will have problems. You have piston failures. So far it's been pretty good. There are the select few that have been having issues. During the 2015 to 2017 refresh of the Gen 2 Coyote engine, Ford decided to release the GT350. Now the GT350 is very special and one of my ultimate favorites, to be honest, due to the reason that it had a flat plane crank, it had a bigger bore, so now it was from a 5.0 to a 5.2 liter, and they also had many things that rolled over into the Gen 3 engine as well. So for instance, this now that has a flat plane crank, you spun the engine up to 8,250 RPM, so you pushed 526 horses all the way up to 7,500 RPM, and you had 429 foot-pounds of torque at 4,700 RPM. So technically speaking, it was a Coyote engine with a different camshaft, stiffer valves, stiffer springs, everything to really spin it up that high. You're talking full-blown track weapon now. But it was mainly repurposed and reworked. And those items were obviously the cams and the intake manifold. It has a special intake manifold just for itself. So other Coyote variants, in addition to the Roadrunner and the Voodoo engine, are both the Bullet and the Predator. The Bullet engine, obviously, is in the Bullet Mustang, which is a special edition Mustang. It got an increase in power due to minor changes, different flow designs, and so on. And it pushes out 480 horsepower versus 460 horsepower, which is what the Gen 3 has. So yes, it does come with a little bit more stout. I know it has active exhaust and all of that stuff, so it's great. But it's kind of like just dressing up, in my opinion. The Gen 3 engine, just a little bit more to squeeze out those 20 horses. The real big one, the elephant in the room, is the Predator, which is in the new GT500. In the GT500, it has cross-plane crank, so it does not have a flat-plane crank. They went back to the old 90-degree design. It's supercharged, has a 2.65 Eaton TBS unit on it. They lowered the compression to 9.5 to 1, and it's basically a CNC ported Voodoo block and engine as a whole. So they took many variations of everything and kind of just kept diving deeper and deeper and deeper until they found a formula that worked. So aside from that though, we're now waiting upon the new Mach 1, which is supposed to have more improvements based off of the Gen 3 Coyote engine. In my opinion, it's very similar to the Bullet. So hopefully that once they start releasing in the public pretty soon, we can get a first take real world example of it and see what it's all about. Hope you guys learned something, enjoyed the history. Hopefully you liked hearing me ramble. And yeah, other than that, hope everybody's doing good out there. Till next time, guys. See you later.